Today we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the prophet Elisha, one of the greater prophets of the Old Testament time. I'd like to review with you a little bit about his life and what he did, when he lived, some of the things that he did, the message that he brought to the people of his time. We mentioned Elisha briefly in our last message about Elijah. Elisha was selected by Elijah at God's command to be his successor. And the call of Elisha is an interesting story in itself. Elisha was a son of a rather prosperous farmer, and he was working out in the field with other servants of his father when Elijah appeared. And Elijah put his cloak around him and told him to follow him. Elisha was surprised and humbled by this call. And he asked if he could go say goodbye to his family. And Elijah told him, well, do what you think you need to do. And so Elisha slaughtered the oxen he had been using to plow the field, and he broke up the plow and used the wood of that to offer these animals as a sacrifice to God. And then he had a small farewell party with his servants and family, and then he followed Elisha. We don't know exactly how old Elisha was at this point in time, but he might have been actually in his late 30s or early 40s, based on the length of time that he ministered after this. Elisha served as a prophet for about 50 years, between approximately 850 BC to about 800 BC. During that time, he gave warnings and messages to over a dozen kings of Israel and of Judah. Now, following Elisha's call, he actually spent a period of time training and working under Elijah, acting as his personal secretary and assistant. We don't know how much of an overlap there was between the time that Elijah called him and the time that Elijah was translated. But they did work together for a bit of time, where Elisha trained and instructed Elisha as to his duties and responsibilities. And he witnessed many of the things that Elijah said and did. But at least a few years passed between the time that Elijah called him and the time that Elijah was translated, and that he took over duties as chief prophet to the kingdom of Israel. He, of course, went with Elijah and crossed the river Jordan when Elijah was translated. And as we read in the scripture reading, when Elijah asked him if there was anything he could do or anything that he wanted, his request was for a double portion of the Spirit that had fallen on Elijah. And Elijah was impressed by this request, and also told him that what he wanted was something difficult, but that if he saw him when he was translated, then God would grant this request. And indeed, he did see his master's translation and receive this double portion that he had requested. Now, following the translation of Elijah, Elisha returned to the city of Jericho, which was the closest town to the site of the translation. There was a school of the prophets there, and the school, members of the school as well as the fathers of the city, came to him with a problem. The waters of Jericho were salty and bitter. They needed the springs in order to support their city and the agriculture of the area. And they asked if Elisha could do something about this problem. And Elisha commanded them to dump salt into the water, into the springs. Now, usually when you add salt to water, does that make it taste good? Anyone like drinking salt water? No, usually we don't drink salt water. Sometimes we gargle with it, right? If you have a sore throat, and salt water is good for helping your throat. Hot salt water. Hot salt water. Salt has medicinal properties, healing properties, cleaning properties. But putting salt into water for a drinking source, that seemed kind of like a foolish thing to do, right? I mean, if you were going to drink water, you wouldn't pour a whole bunch of salt into it before you drink it. That just doesn't really make a lot of sense. But this is in keeping with something that we find again and again in the Bible. God often commands us to do things that don't make sense. He often gives us directions which seem silly or illogical or backwards or foolish, which by all worldly standards of intellect and reasoning and knowledge are foolish. The Bible tells us that God tests us. He wants to show that the world's way and His way are not one and the same. And that if we trust Him and follow Him and do as He commands, regardless of how silly or how foolish or how crazy, how inconvenient that might be, that we will be blessed. And the fathers of the city and the school of the prophets, they followed Elisha's commands. They poured salt into the springs, and the springs of Jericho became very sweet. And after that, it was a very famous aspect of the city, the quality of the water. And this was the first miracle that Elisha performed in his ministry. Now, the next story that occurs is rather interesting, that Elisha was traveling through the countryside, and a large group of boys came to see him as he was walking along the path through the woods. And they began to joke and laugh at him. And they said, "Oh, go up, Baldy." I guess Elisha didn't have much hair. My wife complains that my forehead is receding. They insulted him and they made jokes about him. "Go up, old Baldy," and go up as in, like your master. Your master was translated, if you're such a great prophet, let's watch you. Let's see God take you home too. And the Bible says that Elisha cursed them for their irreverence and their blasphemy, speaking against God's prophet and against the miracles that God had performed in translating Elijah. And almost immediately out of the wood came two big bears, and these bears attacked and injured almost 50 of these boys. Needless to say, after that, people didn't make jokes about Elijah's hair, or Elisha's hair, or about him being translated. Now, we might read this story and think that that's kind of severe, Why would these boys be mauled or attacked? Seems very brutal. But you have to remember the time in which this story took place. It was a time where people believed very clearly in the connection between good actions and good results, and evil actions and evil results. And the power of miracles and the power of God were things that people looked at and accepted and believed, contrary to today's society, which is one of doubt and cynicism and skepticism. And the consequences that came upon these boys came because of their own actions. And actually they escaped rather lightly. It doesn't say that any of the boys died from this mauling. And the actual penalty for speaking against God, according to the Ten Commandments, was, of course, death by stoning, which they did not receive. The place that this took place was Bethel. And Bethel was significant because it was one of two centers of golden calf worship in Israel at that time. So these boys were from a community that actually did not respect and believe in God. Their city, their town was famous. It was a place of pilgrimage for idol worship. And the people of Bethel, most of them, were idolaters. They worshipped the golden calf. They got their money from the people who came to buy sacrifices and to worship there at that town. And so the attack of the bears on these boys was also an attack against idolatry of this region. And it was a sign of God's strength and power over the golden calf that these boys were injured for their attack and insults against Elisha. Now, we don't have time this morning to talk about all of the aspects of Elisha's life and all the things that he did, but Elisha's ministry included two aspects. On one hand, many of the things that he did were of benefit to local people, simple people of Israel who had problems or trouble. An example of that was a widow who had two sons, and creditors were going to seize her boys to cover the bills that she owed. And she came to the prophet and asked for help. Now, there are lots of different ways that Elisha could have helped her. He could have simply given her the money. People gave gifts to the prophet. He used that money to help the schools of the prophets, different people in need. I'm sure that Elisha could have simply given her money to settle her debt. He could have gone and talked to the creditors. This woman is in trouble. As a favor to me, please excuse her debt, or please forgive her debt. But he didn't do either of those things. Instead, he simply told the widow, collect all the pots and jars that you can, and what resource do you have now? And she said, well, I just have one small jar of oil. She said, well, take that jar and use that to fill up all the pots and pans that you have in your house and any that you can collect from your neighbors. Now, that's a simple thing of science, right? You have one jar. How can one jar fill up a lot of others? That's impossible, right? Sometimes when you have a thing of drink, you're going to share it, you'll pour it, like half and half and half, or quarter, until it's all gone. But, you're still limited to the volume of that one container. But again, this woman did not question Elisha or say that what he was asking was foolish. She told her sons to do that. They collected all the jars and containers in their house. They borrowed some from some of their neighbors, and they began to pour. And they filled up all of these containers. And she was able to sell the surplus oil that she had and pay the debts that she had. A simple request handled in a simple way through the power of God, through Elisha. Another example of the personal kind of ministry was a woman who offered generosity and hospitality to Elisha. Of course, Elisha traveled from place to place as he visited different communities, as he trained the various schools of the prophets located around the kingdom, as he visited the king, the palace. And as he traveled back and forth, there was one village, Shunem, that he often passed through. And in this village there was a farmer and his wife, and the wife told the farmer, you know, the prophet comes through here all the time. Let's help him out. Let's do something for the prophet. And so the husband agreed, whatever you want to do. And they made an extra room on the roof of their house, and they offered that to Elisha. That whenever he was passing through the area, he was welcome to spend the night in this room. They would provide him with food and drink. So they gave him a place to stay and provided for him as he traveled back and forth. And of course, this was a great relief to Elisha. And so he asked the woman, you know, is there anything you need, or is there anything I can do for you? And the woman was childless, and so she told Elisha that, yes, you know, my husband and I have no children. And Elisha said, well, this time next year, you will have a son. And that came to pass, that she did have a baby. And the years went by, the boy grew up. And one day, the boy became very sick. And he actually died. And the mother commanded that the servants put the boy in Elisha's room. And she ordered the servant to go and look for Elisha. And so the servant went and found Elisha and explained what had happened. And Elisha ordered his servant Gehazi to take his staff and to run to that village and place the staff on the boy. And so Gehazi did that. He ran ahead of his master, placed the staff on the boy, and Elisha followed at his own speed. And when Elisha arrived, he went upstairs, he prayed over the boy, and the Lord restored the boy to life. And Elisha was able to present the boy back to his mother and father. And several years later, there was a time of famine in the land, and Elisha warned this family that the famine was coming and that they should leave the area to find a place of safety during this time of famine. And the family left the land, and they did successfully live in another place during this 7 years of famine. And when they returned, during that 7 years, other people had taken over their property. And so the family went to the court to try to get justice. And at the court, as they were brought in, Gehazi happened to be there. And he told the king who these people were and introduced them to the king. And because of Elisha's kindness to these people and these people's kindness to Elisha, the king granted their case. And so they were able to reclaim their house and their property. All of this from one act of generosity and kindness. The Bible tells us that we should be generous and kind and hospitable to strangers. And this woman's generosity resulted in a great deal of happiness and long-term benefit for she and her family. Of course, Elisha, as a prophet, was also involved with not just the individual people, but also with the affairs of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And shortly after his ascension to the role of prophet, there was an alliance between Israel and Judah against the kingdom of Moab. And the armies of Israel and Judah went to invade and to attack the Moabites. And Elisha was brought along with the army because he was from Israel. But the king of Israel at that time was not really a God-fearing man. But when the kings met to plan the battle and to plan the campaign, they inquired of their prophets And the king of Judah at that time was Jehoshaphat, and he was a very God-fearing man. And so he asked specifically that Elisha give them counsel and advice about the upcoming campaign against Moab. And Elisha said, well, my king believes in Baal. You should ask the prophets of Baal what they think. But he said, because you, Jehoshaphat, are a follower of God, I will answer your request. And he prophesied that the armies would be victorious, that they would defeat the Moabites. And later, as they traveled into the land of Moab, that area, of course, is very desert-like, and the armies ran out of water in the desert. And the kings again called council. What should we do? How are we going to survive? Where are we going to get water for our men and our animals? And again they consulted the prophets. And Elisha again gave directions which sounded very foolish. Well, have your army dig trenches. Dig ditches all up and down the desert floor. How many of you have been in the desert before? Any of you ever been in a desert? A few hands. Okay. What's a desert like? Very dry, hot, and I mean, desert usually have two kinds of terrain. You have sand dunes, that's what people often associate with desert. Or you have rock. The ground is like iron, because, there's no water. And it's usually hard packed. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us which of these two was there, but from the geology of that area, it was probably the rock. Have any of you enjoyed trying to dig in rocky ground before? Any of you farmers? I know Noah does some farming. Now today we have lots of tools to help us with that. We have rototillers, these big machines that'll just cut up the ground. They didn't have that back then. All they had were their weapons, because they were at war. They didn't even have farming tools with them probably. They might have had picks, because siege warfare, they used picks to tear down walls. But to dig a bunch of ditches in this rocky desert ground, out in the heat, I'm sure that was not a popular command. The order was given, and the soldiers were probably cursing. This is crazy. If we're going to dig, let's dig down. Dig a well. If we dig a well, we can understand that. We'll dig down and find water, and we can draw it up. But just to dig these long ditches, 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers long, that's just stupid. And yet, the orders were given, and the army carried out those orders. And as these ditches were finished, these ditches were filled by water from God. And God provided all the water that they needed to the army. Now, a second benefit of this miracle was that the Moabites were watching. They were spying and observing what was happening. And at a distance, when they saw these ditches, and there was liquid in the ditches, and the color of the earth was, what color? Desert, rock. It was red, or reddish brown. And so from a distance, when they looked at these ditches, they looked like they were filled with blood. The reflection of the earth made it look like these ditches were filled with blood. And of course, the people were all gathered around the ditches trying to get water. And the Moabites, they completely misunderstood the situation. They thought that the armies had begun to fight each other, and that the ditches were filled with the blood of these armies as they were fighting, because Israel and Judah were enemies many times. And so the Moabites came down to attack them out of their defenses, and they were badly defeated by the combined alliance of Israel and Judah. And so the prophecy of Elisha came to pass, that the Moabites were badly beaten. There are many other stories I could tell, but we're running short of time. So the last story that I'll just touch on is one I'm sure many of you have heard before, and that is the story of Naaman. Everybody know Naaman, right? And again, it's a kind of a curious story, which combines a personal aspect with that of the state. Of course, Naaman was a general, but he was not an Israelite general. He was a Syrian general. Who were the Syrians? Anybody know? The Syrians. Were they friends of Israel? No. Syria has never been friends of Israel. Even today, the Syrians and the Israelis hate each other. They do not get along. And it goes way back. Thousands of years. The Syrians were traditional enemies of Israel. And they often fought over land in what is today actually part of Jordan, the east bank of the Jordan. And Naaman was one of the generals of Syria. So he was not a friend of Israel. But as you know in the story, Naaman contracted leprosy, which at that time was a very serious problem. If you had leprosy, you were cast out of society. You had to live in isolation because there was no cure for leprosy in those days. And it was a very contagious disease. And in his household, Naaman had a slave girl who was from Israel. And she told her mistress that her God could cure Naaman. Now, that took a great amount of faith and courage. You know, if you were a slave and you said, "Oh, master, my God can cure you," and it didn't happen, what do you think would happen to that slave? Not probably the best situation. But this girl, in her simple faith, she witnessed to the power of the true God. And finally, in desperation, Naaman went to Israel looking for a cure. And he started out by going to the capital of Israel, to Samaria. And he went to the palace. And the king of Israel was very surprised and also very afraid when Naaman showed up. This was a general of his worst enemy. And at that time, Syria was stronger than Israel. And he didn't want to start a new war at this point in time. And Naaman said, "I've come to be cured of leprosy." And the king was like, "Are you crazy? Are you crazy? You're just trying to start a war, aren't you? You're looking for an excuse. You know I can't cure you, and so you're going to tell your king, and he's going to send his army and attack us." And it's interesting that the king of Israel, that's the only thinking he had. And in fact, Elisha sent his servant to the palace and told the king, "Send him to me." The king had the knowledge of God and he had the prophet of God, but he never stopped to think about that resource. It never even entered his mind. He completely ignored or overlooked that. And partially it was because he wasn't a true believer in God. He was worshiping other gods. And so, as you know in the story, Naaman went to Elisha's house. And he was surprised because when he got there, it wasn't a big palace. It wasn't a great villa. It was just a simple place. And there was no big reception. You know, he was an important person. He was on a diplomatic mission. Usually when diplomats go to other countries, what do you see? Oh, people lined up. waving flags and, clapping and cheering and, oh, welcome. Welcoming parties. Even in Japan, it's always on the news. Oh, someone visiting from this country or another. And even celebrities, someone like Tom Cruise comes to Japan and, all these people are at the airport. Right? Even just celebrities. There are people there to meet them and to welcome them and to show them respect and honor. But when Naaman got to Elisha's house, one guy was standing there. Just one man. And he wasn't even dressed in any great clothes. He's just a simple dude. And this guy didn't even really give Naaman a chance to speak. He just said, oh, my master told you to go and wash in the Jordan River 7 times and you will be healed. Have a nice day. And he went back inside. Now, Naaman was from Syria, and Syria, the capital of Syria was Damascus. That's where he lived. And Damascus was famous for its beautiful rivers at that time. It had 2 big rivers that were famous for its clean, pure running water. It was an oasis town. And the Jordan River, on the other hand, was not a very clean river. The Jordan River just ran down from Galilee down to the Dead Sea. Most of the time, it was a very slow or still river. So the water tended to be kind of murky and dirty, except during the spring after the rain when the river would run fast. And so Naaman was not happy about being told to go and wash in the Jordan River. He thought it was a dirty river. It wasn't very clean. How could he be clean from leprosy if he got into that dirty water? I mean, if someone said, oh, go into Dotonbori Canal and wash up and you'll be cleaned of your illness, how many of you would like to do that? Some Tigers fans jump into the Dotonbori when the Tigers win, but, it's pretty crazy. Yeah, the water's not very clean. And yet, this is what Naaman was told to do. And Naaman got really upset. And he just turned off and said, we're going home. Enough of this. Now, fortunately for Naaman, he had some good staff members. And his staff members, after he calmed down a little bit, said, sir, if the prophet had given you some difficult task, like, climb to the top of Mount Hermon, the tallest mountain, and offer a sacrifice there, would you have done that? Would you have climbed up the mountain by yourself, carrying the sacrifice, and done that? And Naaman said, yeah, I probably would have done that. Well, if you're willing to do something so difficult, what risk? What do you have to lose by doing something so simple? And Naaman was not a stupid man. And he thought over what his servant said, and he had to agree that he had nothing to lose and everything to gain. And so he ordered his group, his procession, to go down to the Jordan River. And they went down there, and he went into the water as he was commanded, and he washed himself up 7 times, just as Elisha had directed. And when he came out of the water after the 7th time, he was spotless. And he was amazed. And he was thankful. He realized that this was not some natural event. That he had been cured, not by the waters of the Jordan. It was a dirty river. There wasn't anything magical about those waters. He had been cured by the God of Israel. And so he went back to Elisha's house. And with great gratitude, he spoke to the prophet. He's like, I have all of these gifts I brought. Please, let me give them to you as a token of my gratitude. You know, I have gold and silver and fine silks from Damascus. Anything you want, everything, I'll give it to you for your God. And you can use this however you want. And Elisha said, thank you, but no thanks. I appreciate your offer, but I have no need of these gifts. And Naaman went home. Now, it'd be nice if the story could end there, but there's an unfortunate postscript. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, he had worked with him for many years. He had witnessed many of the miracles that Elisha had performed. He had seen the power of God. He saw what had happened with Naaman. But Gehazi had a problem. He liked money. He was kind of a greedy guy. And when he saw the pack train and the camels with the bags of gold and silver and all of those clothes, he was just like, wow. Imagine what I could do with 1 or 2 bags of that. How many of you like to dream about being rich? You're lying. Nobody's raising their hand. Okay, yeah. All of us, right? All of us, you know, at some point, oh, what would you do if you had $1 million? What would you do if you did this, right? We all like to dream. You know, it's human nature. But Gehazi had it right there in front of him. His future was right there on those camels. And as he saw him going away, his mind was thinking. It's like, what can I do? How can I rescue this situation? And he came up with an idea. So he waited a while. It's like looking over. Master was studying or doing something. He's like, okay, I can go out for a while. And so he went out and he followed after Naaman. And a few miles down the road, he caught up to them and said, oh, excuse me, sir. Oh, what is it? Naaman was in a very happy mood. Sure, Gehazi, it's good to see you. Is there a problem? What can I help you with? Well, two sons of the prophets came to the master's home, and they have some needs. And perhaps you can help us with that. And Naaman was, sure, what do you want? I have a whole caravan. Take whatever you need. He's like, oh, you're too kind. You're too kind. But his mind was cooking. Well, you know, 2 bags and a couple of clothes. And he loaded up. He loaded up what he could carry. And he waved and said goodbye. And he didn't go back to his master. Instead, he went home and he found a nice spot. He dug a hole, put everything in the ground, covered up, and then went back to Elisha. And Elisha's like, oh, where have you been, Gehazi? You haven't been around for a little while. What you been up to? Oh, nothing. Nothing. What do you need, master? And Elisha said, because of your greed, because of your avarice, because of your covetousness, you received the curse of Naaman upon you to go along with the riches that you stole. Those riches did not belong to you. And Gehazi was cursed with leprosy. And according to the Bible, that lasted several generations in his family. Now again, we might think, that sounds very severe. But Gehazi's action cast a shadow on what? God had done for Naaman. The witness of, oh yes, we'll take gifts or money for the blessing. It created a little bit of a negative image. Maybe not so much in Naaman's mind, because he was a firm believer of God after that. But in some of his officers and staff, people that had not been converted, they were like, oh yeah, these guys are they're just like the prophets we have back home, you know. They'll do something, but they want something in exchange, you know. You give a healing and we'll take a little bit of gold and silver from you in exchange. And it created a negative witness and a negative image in these men's minds. And today we see the same thing, you know. There are many people working, doing evangelistic work. There are many television ministries and radio ministries. The Adventist Church, we have a number of different programs. They do good work. But there are some of those kinds of ministries that are like, oh, you know, now it's donation time. Please send your money in. Yeah, and it's like the owner of the station is like driving a Mercedes and he has a big house. Yes, me and my wife, we need this money for our ministry. Don't mind our diamond jewelry and our Rolex watches. It's all part of God's plan for us. Thank you for your support. There are a lot of people today who make money off of doing God's work. To them it's just a job, it's a profession. It's an act. And there are a lot of innocent people who donate and support, in good faith, the work of these different groups. But those kinds of people and their actions, it creates a negative influence. You know, if you say an America TV evangelist, most people don't think of It Is Written. Or Doug Batchelor, they think of, you know, Tammy Lee Baker and her husband with all their jewelry in their houses. The negative image created by these kinds of people spreads over the whole group. And even those who are doing God's work and who are working honestly, they are given an unfair reputation by the greed and avarice of the others. And this is what Gehazi was cursed for. His action caused a negative reputation to be connected with the work of God and the prophets of God. Elisha worked for many years, as I said early on. And probably he lived until his 80s or 90s, based on what information we know about him. And even after his death, we have an interesting story connected with him. A man died, and when they were going to bury him, they took him to the place to be buried, which happened to be the same area, or the same place, that Elisha was buried. And when the body of the man they were going to lower him, they dropped him. And he rolled into the area where Elisha's bones were lying. And when the body of the dead man landed on the bones of Elisha, the man was resurrected. He came back to life. And of course, everybody was stunned. Even in death, Elisha had an influence beyond the grave. We don't know how many years after this it took place. According to Jewish tradition, the man who came to life only lived one day and then died again. So he didn't live a full life according to Jewish custom and tradition outside of the Bible. But it is an interesting note. The last comment about Elisha is about his bones bringing another man to life. Today we've talked a little bit about Elisha. He was a man who unlike Elijah, who was kind of a fiery, dynamic, bolt from the blue kind of a person, Elisha was more of a laid-back, pastoral kind of a person than just the fire and brimstone prophet that Elijah was. And yet he served very long and very faithfully, guiding 6 kings and doing his best to keep the people following the reign of God and the worship of God. We may not always have the same kind of opportunities and powers to shake kingdoms like Elijah did. But we all can, in our daily work and daily tasks, work with the simple, calm perseverance that Elisha demonstrated during his time. And that is my hope for each one of us. Thank you.
Amen.